As I've mentioned in my 3 books and also in some of the videos that I've done, the Boers had a fascination with carving their names on the rifles. It was basically a custom, and not all, but certainly many of them carved their names and decorations onto the butts and stocks of their rifles. What I have here today is another M1895 Boer Mauser rifle in 7x57mm caliber. It's a DWM, serial number 6015. The thing which of course interested me when I first bought the rifle, which I took many years to get out of a friend of mine, is very neatly carved on the butt is P. Elof, that's E-L-O-F-F, Mafeking, March in Dutch, March 1900. Now that tells 2 stories. It tells us about Burger P. Elof and also about Mafeking. And you students of the Boer War will well know that there were 3 sieges during the Anglo-Boer War. The Siege of Mafeking, the Siege of Kimberley and the Siege of Ladysmith. The one which grabbed the most media attention was Mafeking. It was the smallest and most insignificant of all 3 sieges, but there was quite a remarkable fellow who was in charge. That's Colonel Robert Baden-Powell, was sent out as a special service officer prior to the war actually breaking out. He went out with a few other officers and all dressed in mufti. The Boers weren't supposed to know about them, and he was told to raise 2 regiments of mounted infantry, which he did do. He was based at Mafeking and he raised these regiments in Rhodesia, which of course is now Zimbabwe. Well, 2 days after the war broke out, which was the 11th of October 1899, Boer forces under General Piet Cronje and also Snyman were headed towards Mafeking, and other Boer forces went towards Kimberley, and Ladysmith crossed into the Natal border, which we've already discussed. Cronje had between 5,500 to 8,000 men, depending on when they were there, to surround this little garrison of about 1,300 people. Now Mafeking was a small, as I mentioned, insignificant, dusty little town in the middle of nowhere. The reason it was important was because it was a rail link and a station on the way between Kimberley and Rhodesia. Baden-Powell did his homework. He knew that war was inevitable. So he built up the supplies and as much in the way of armaments that he could muster in the short time he had prior to war breaking out. In fact, all he had was 7 Maxim machine guns, that's the .303 Maxim machine guns, and 7 old artillery pieces. And these were the likes of 7-pounder muzzle-loading cannons, so they were pretty useless with a very short range. The Boers soon brought up one of their siege guns, which was a 155mm Schneider Creosote siege gun, which is what they had in one of their forts around Pretoria. They commenced a bombardment of Mafeking, but thanks to Baden-Powell, he really grabbed the attention of the whole empire. He was an innovative fellow. He did all sorts of things to trick the Boers. He built minefields. Some of them did have mines, but he put signs up saying minefields all over the place. He built redoubts. He had forts built. He had searchlights, he had rigged up signalling systems, all to bamboozle the Boers, and he managed to do this. The Boers in the 8-month siege, which was, by the way, 216 days between October and May 1900, when the besiegers were relieved, the Boers never ever made a concerted effort to storm Mafeking. Piet Cronje, who was the major Boer general, he left after some time to go down to the likes of Modder River and also Margaretfontein, which we've talked about before. He left in charge General Snyman, who was a rather timid fellow. He really didn't have the get up and go. I think a lot of the Boers under him lacked confidence because he lacked confidence, and as I said, they never actually did an assault on Mafeking. So there we have it. We're talking about a Boer rifle with a significant history. There were quite a few contenders for P. Elof. Now Elof is quite a well-known name in South Africa. There was another fellow called Cyril Elof. He was a lieutenant in the ZARP, the ZAR police, ZARPs they used to call them. He actually became a lieutenant in 1894 and eventually ended up being the officer commanding the fort at Johannesburg. Well, Cyril Elof was just the opposite to Snyman. He was a get-up-and-go character, and right before the end of the siege, about 6 days prior to the end of the siege, he managed to convince Snyman that they really needed to get on with the job, and together with some followers, he actually attacked a fort in Mafeking. He went through the Ballalong quarters, which was the black African side of the village, and actually attacked the fort, but he didn't get the backing that he was hoping to get. And at the end of the day, he was captured. He actually sat down and had dinner that night with Baden-Powell, which shows you there was still a lot of chivalry in the business. And he was packed off to St Helena, where he was also quite a big figure, and he twice escaped, by the way. So that's Cyril Earloff. He was actually the grandson of Paul Kruger, who we've all heard of. We'll be showing you a letter from the Commandant General's office where it's actually addressed to Cyril Earloff, Lieutenant, Fort Johannesburg. Now, I've known that the Earloff family seemed to come from around Rustenburg mainly, but the ones that I've found, there were 16 Boers named Eloff who claimed their campaign medals. Unfortunately, none of the ones with P did claim a medal. However, there were 5 men named P. Eloff who were actually captured. All their names differ slightly, and they all had a second initial, so it's impossible for me to actually identify who this was. Many years ago, a lady very kindly in Rustenburg did some genealogy work for me, and she found a Mr. P. Eloff, who was married in 1885 to Miss Susanna Fenter. It could well have been him, but once again, without a second initial, I was unable to say who it was. So there we have it. P. Eloff, defence of Mafeking and the attack on Mafeking. The other outstanding thing about Baden-Powell, as I mentioned, he grabbed the whole empire was over the moon about Baden-Powell. There was a lot of media coverage. What he did during the siege is he raised a little cadet corps. So what Baden-Powell did was really very innovative in as much as he used these young boys as opposed to using men from the town guard. So these boys were able to run messages between the different forts, between the different redoubts, etc. During his attack, or should I say defence of Mafeking, Baden-Powell raised a local town guard. And these were the likes of the butchers, the bakers, the candlestick makers, tradesmen in the town. They were all armed very often with older Martini Henry rifles, whatever they could lay their hands on. And they all helped to defend the town. As mentioned, Baden-Powell had all these ideas, and he really did capture the imagination of the empire. Shortly after the Boer War, he emerged as a hero of the Boer War. There were many medallions and postcards struck with Baden-Powell, featuring Baden-Powell, one of which we'll show you. He wrote a book called Fieldcraft and Scouting around about 1906, 1907. And Baden-Powell became very famous in as much as he was the founder of the Boy Scout movement. And the Boy Scout movement, as you probably know, has the Fleur-de-Lis badge with BP for Baden-Powell. He was always the head of the Boy Scout movement, and as such became a very famous person. Right at the end of the day, he was actually made a baron. So that just goes to show, how famous this man became. So here we have it, an old Boer rifle from the Boer War, which tells an interesting story, and also a very historic name being Mafeking. When the Mafeking was relieved on the 17th of May 1900, there's a new word appeared in the British Oxford Dictionary, and that was to Maffick. And evidently the people were over the moon in London and Piccadilly. They were jumping around and dancing in the streets, and they were told that they were Mafficking out of pure joy of the raising of the siege of Mafeking. I hope you enjoyed the story.